Good morning everyone, Jason here. This week we are going to take a look at the environment thumbnail sketching process. For this particular example, I am doing it based on the theme of school. So I am designing a few education institutions for the characters in the game. So I start off first by looking at some reference. Over here I am creating another window using window arrange new window so that it gives me a zoomed out preview of what I've done so far. So my usual workflow includes a music playlist. I find that it helps me a lot with gauging the time. I start off first with a radial gradient. Personally, I find it easier to start with a gradient rather than a white canvas, as to me the white canvas is very intimidating. So similar to how I did my still life paintings, I used the lasso tool together with a textured brush to quickly paint in shapes. The initial steps for environment thumbnail involves me finding interesting shapes. So right now I'm just experimenting. For this particular part, I am looking at the clouds, trying to give them a bit of a more dynamic shape. Over here I'm also trying to use the direction of the clouds to lead the player's eyes to the main building, which I will put in a moment. So it's drawing attention from outside the canvas to somewhere in the 1/3 point of the drawing. So an easy way to build depth is to have multiple planes. So for example, for this particular example, I use overlapping mountains to indicate the depth of this sketch. As you can see right now, there's already 4 levels of depth: the sky, the background mountain, the mid-ground mountain, and of course the foreground mountain that I just added. And all these have corresponding tonal values. So the further the mountain is, or the closer it is to the background, the lighter it should be. For the building itself, I prefer to use the square brush with no transfer, set at about 70% opacity. This gives me the flexibility to work in the silhouette of the building. To me, it's much easier compared to using the lasso tool, because I can just edit and paint in details on the painting, on the building, as and when I like. So over here, you notice that I constantly refer back to the reference images on Google. It's important to, especially if you are referencing a particular style of architecture, to always go back and take a look at your reference so that you can maintain authenticity. So usually I have a little bit of a rough idea before I approach a particular thumbnail. Sometimes I will sketch it out with a pen on paper. It's faster for me to express my ideas that way, but different people have different kind of workflow. For me, I like to sketch on paper with pen before I actually transfer it here into digital format. So I tend to have a rough idea before I start, but when I'm painting, sometimes new ideas come to me. For example, for this particular piece, I initially thought that the school would just be a individual building, so it's just a lone building in the mountains. But I realized that it's not particularly interesting to have just one tower. So I began to build smaller towns or smaller buildings around the main building. These smaller buildings also help to suggest the scale of the main building, the main tower, because of the contrast, right? The main tower is huge, whereas the other buildings are fairly small. So each thumbnail here took me about 30 to 35 minutes, I would like to say. For this particular video, I sped it up by about 50%. So it's the regular timing is about 2 times of this video. It's important to keep your environment thumbnails rough and loose, and one of the tips is to really try to limit yourself to just 30 to 35 minutes, maybe 30 to 45 minutes depending on your skill level. Maybe it's the first time you're trying it, you might want to do it for about 45 to an hour. The main reason is because let's say for this one idea of a school, you'll be creating anywhere between 3 to 8 thumbnails. You must understand that for example, if let's say you create 8 thumbnails, the other 7 thumbnails will most likely not be used at all in the final game. So imagine if let's say you would spend 2 hours on each thumbnail, and let's say 7 of them were not used in the end. You basically wasted 14 hours. So what I'm trying to say here is that by being very economical with the strokes and all that, and saving a lot of time during the thumbnail creation process, you can either generate more thumbnails, which is good because you have more ideas, or you can spend less time on this particular aspect of production, and at the end of the day you won't feel too bad if the idea is not being used. After all, it's just a 30-minute sketch. And to make me conform to this time limit, I personally find that having a music playlist is very helpful. One thing for me sometimes, because painting environments is not exactly my forte, but you know, I have to do it. Sometimes good music can really take your mind off the more medial task and make it more interesting. Sometimes music can inspire you. Perhaps, for example, if I were to be listening to some Tibetan Oriental music, I might feel inspired while creating this piece. For this particular example, I'm not. But I'm trying to say is it can inspire you. And lastly, the because you created the music playlist yourself, you know when your time is almost up. For example, when the last song comes up, you know that you have about 3 to 5 minutes left for this particular thumbnail. So right now I'm going back in again to sort of detail out the clouds. I think I tend to spend a little bit more time on clouds than I want to. Personally, I really enjoy painting clouds. It's just I don't know. I guess it's because there's really no one way to paint clouds, and the flexibility of painting clouds really intrigues me. And I really like how clouds can be really expressive. For the more epic paintings, I like to paint really epic looking clouds. Really helps to sell the story of the piece. So yeah, as I mentioned, I think I probably spent a little bit too much time on the clouds. Now I am moving on to create the snow on the mountains. So right now I'm using the lasso tool. I'm drawing out areas near the summit of the mountain. Usually snow will be concentrated around that region because it's the coldest near the peak. And over here I again use the textured brush to quickly block in very light tones to indicate the snow. As you can see, it's a very fast way to paint out the snow. And right now I'm trying to darken the sky a little bit to so-called separate the mountain layer and the sky layer. Over here I am using the slanted brush that I use for the rocks for the material studies. The same brush. And what I'm doing here is I'm just using that to cut in areas of the rock. So I'm removing some of the snow and adding the snow somewhere else. To give it more of an interesting look. Again, right now, for the thumbnail process, I'm really just looking at shapes, right? I'm not trying to identify interesting shapes that I can introduce to the canvas. So over here, I am really inspired, or I really find that it's very interesting that one of the reference image that I saw in Google had this grass plane in the background. And I thought it was a very cool idea. Again, to introduce depth. And I wanted to sort of incorporate that idea into my own thumbnail. So here I just added in a stream. So again, notice throughout the entire process, I haven't been zooming in at all. Given that I am only doing this particular concept for 30, or allocating a budget of 30 to 35 minutes for this particular concept, I have no time to zoom in and be overly fixated on details. Another great way to introduce depth is by creating fog. Because things in the far will be affected by what we call atmospheric perspective, which is basically fog. Here I'm adding another mountain plane. Again, the more levels or the more planes you have, the more depth you're going to introduce to the sketch. Again, just using the slanted brush to carve out some of the rocks on the mountain. So over here I am zooming it a little bit, doing the final touches for this painting. Now it's a trope within the entertainment industry for the concept artist to add in characters in the foreground in environment paintings. The point of this is to suggest the depth of this painting by comparing the size between objects in the foreground and objects in the background. So for this particular sketch, it's the character and the building in the background. So I'm not putting not going to introduce too much details for these characters. It's mainly just a silhouetted figure standing in the foreground. Over here I made a mistake and I painted them on the same layer as the foreground mountains. So right now I'm painting back. I'm separating the two into individual layers and painting that back the foreground. The reason is because it allows me to tweak the foreground layer, as you can see just now, individually. And right now I'm just using a curves adjustment layer to increase the contrast. And over here I am filling a layer with black, setting it to color dodge, and using a light gray I am painting in the lighting. So it's a very easy way to introduce light. For this particular piece, I'm envisioning a sort of a evening glow, and that's about it. On to the next thumbnail. So when you think about school, or when I think about school, a fantastical school, the first thing that comes to my mind is Hogwarts, School of Wizardry. Alright, so for this second thumbnail, I am trying to emulate Hogwarts. As usual, I create a playlist for about 30 to 35 minutes long in duration. I start off with a radial gradient, and I immediately block in the big shapes with the lasso tool and a textured brush. So for this particular sketch, I want it to be a night scene. You know, I want to try something different. Usually when you watch Harry Potter movies, Hogwarts is the establishing shot or the environment shot of the castle usually happens at night. So that's the iconic image of Hogwarts. Trying to emulate that in this particular sketch. So it's the same thing for this particular sketch as with the one previously. I am blocking in big shapes, trying to separate out each individual plane. The more planes or the more levels that you create, the more depth you introduce to your canvas. So over here, I envision a train coming in. Those that watch the film, the Harry Potter films, or read the books will know that the students usually report to school at the start of the semester by train. Here I am detailing the sky, adding a little bit of a gradient. So usually I start off with a radial gradient, but it's possible to use a linear gradient. But to me, the good thing about the radial gradient is that it really draws attention to one particular spot. And I would usually begin the gradient where I think the main attraction of that particular piece is. So for example, the main attraction for this sketch is the castle itself, and I am thinking that it will be situated near the right hand side 1/3 mark of the canvas. So right now I am beginning to block in the castle itself. As with the previous example, I am using the square brush for the buildings, because again, it is a lot easier for me to control and to sketch out the silhouette as compared to the lasso tool. The lasso tool is great for really big shapes, such as the bridge where the train is coming in right now, and of course irregular shapes like the mountain ranges at the back. So I'm doing more research as to how I want to see how I want to design the medieval or the castle, following the style of a medieval castle. So the more you design really anything in particular, the more your brain will store all this information in your long-term memory to what we call the visual memory. So for example, the more I draw the medieval castle style of buildings, the more I will know exactly what are shapes to look out for, what's the purpose of its structure. For example, what's the purpose of the tower, what's the purpose of a wider building, you know. What I'm trying to say here is the more experienced you are, the faster you will be when creating concepts, because you're more familiar with the subject matter. So I'm just slowly adding in the individual towers. you notice that when I paint in the background towers, they are a little bit lighter than the one closer to the viewer. Again, just one of the techniques to suggest that. And then a little bit of details on the buildings. And over here I am creating some light source from within the building itself to really sell the idea that this scene is taken during the night time. So lights from within the building, and also coming up from inside the castle interior. Just trying to paint in the rest of the buildings around the castle. And yeah, I'm moving on from there. The castle itself is still kind of loose, but it sells the idea that it is a castle. Again, the whole point of creating thumbnails like this, so that you don't waste time later. For example, if let's say you dive immediately into the details, immediately with color, and your art director comes back to you and says that you know, I don't really like that idea, then you have essentially wasted half of your day working on something that will not be used for the final game or the final film. So over here I'm just trying to detail the train, because previously it was just a cylinder coming into the canvas. It was not very clear what it was supposed to be. Again, I don't zoom into the canvas. Everything is done very loosely and quickly to save time. Next, I wanted to add a little bit of vegetation, some forest around the castle, using a custom brush here to quickly add in the silhouette of trees to suggest that there's some kind of forest around the school. So right now I'm going back to detail some of the background components. I am working on the lake, so I'm adding in reflection from the island where the school is standing. And really a quick way to suggest that it's a body of water is to add in a little bit of ripples. And I find that a very easy way to add in ripples is to draw streaks like this with the lasso tool, and then quickly filling it with a textured brush with a lighter color, lighter tone. As you can see here, it gives a quick impression that it's a body of water because of the ripple. Okay, at this point in time, the train itself isn't very obvious, I guess. And one of the reasons is because it's a little bit dark and I didn't spend too much time on the details. So to a viewer, it might not look like a train. So I'm adding in some smoke coming out to further suggest that it's a train, and also to draw attention towards it. Lightening up the background mountains a little bit, trying to indicate some forest on the mountains itself. And over here I am using the lasso tool to try to mark out areas I want to paint. Right now I am trying to suggest that there's some lighting shining upwards from within the castle. Again, to give the impression that there's some life within. It's not some abandoned castle or something like that. The current lighting is a little bit too harsh, so I'm going back to the eraser tool to remove some of it. Adding in a little bit more lights on the windows. So another trick for, you know, really suggesting that this castle is massive is the size of the windows. For a normal window, it's usually about the size of a human, from perhaps head to about waist level. So it's a very good indication for the scale of the building. What just happened was I used the elliptical marquee tool to select a circular area, and then I blocked in the moon with a textured brush. And right now I'm using a hard round brush to dot in a few stars. I'm still using the hard round brush to just quickly draw in a little bit of a highlight, or rather the rim light on the train itself, to separate it more from the background. And over here I begin to notice that the train, or the entire bridge, the perspective of it is a little bit wonky. So I'm just transforming it right here to fix it. Don't be afraid to make such changes during the thumbnail phase. It's precisely meant for changes like this, and it's a lot better to do it now, before you actually add colors and more details. When that happens, it becomes a lot harder to change. So yeah, don't be afraid to make major edits to your thumbnails. Over here I'm adding some dragons because why not? You know, I still have a little bit of time in my music playlist. My 35 minutes is not over yet, so yeah, I'm thinking of things to add. And you know, when in doubt, always add dragons, right? And what's better than one dragon? Two dragons, of course. Simply copy dragon and paste it over. Right now I'm trying to change the silhouette so that they don't exactly look like they're being copied over. So again, these dragons are just silhouetted forms. I don't add any details to them. I merely suggest that, hey, there's a dragon over there. Doing the final tricks, using a curves adjustment layer to increase the contrast, but I guess I deleted it because I didn't really like the contrast. I think this is fine. And right here I created a layer with black, set it to color dodge, and use a light tone to create lighting. As you can see, there is a glow effect. So as to give it, to make it look a little bit more mysterious, magical. Just doing some final touch-ups. And I'm done. Moving on to the next one. For the third thumbnail, I thought I would take more time to just improve on the second one. Usually in a production setting, it's very unlikely that your art director will give you something that's so vague, right? School, any kind of school. It's usually the theme or the setting of the game. It's more or less predefined. So for this particular example, I'm still doing a castle. In fact, I am reusing most of what I've already drawn. But to improve on the composition, bring in a little bit more elements, try to make things a bit more interesting. So yeah, I'm showing you how to perhaps improve on your thumbnails if you have the time to do so. Right now I'm just manually flipping some of the levels, some of the layers, because I wanted the main focal point to be on the left instead of the right. I also string down the castle. Because I wanted it to look further away. And I wanted to make the silhouette of this main island a little bit more menacing. Right, so I am slowly introducing shapes that are sharper. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to create like an evil school or something like that. I just want this particular school to look really intimidating. Alright, look like a tough school. No, one does not simply graduate from this school. That sort of feeling. So I'm adding in some spikes. Make it look more dangerous. Easy way to block in the spikes is again to use the lasso tool so that the edges are very clean. While working on this, I actually saw a cool concept art with a waterfall in the foreground of that particular concept art, and I decided to incorporate some of that idea into this thumbnail. So right now I am building the foreground. And adding in the waterfall here. And notice that there really isn't enough space for me to explore that waterfall idea. I can't really tell right now that it's a waterfall, so I am shifting everything up. To give more room for the waterfall. Again, as mentioned in the previous thumbnail, don't be too afraid to make big changes at the thumbnail stage, because that's precisely why we are doing thumbnails in the first place. Allow for you to experiment. Don't overly commit into any one environment sketch. So I really wanted the school to look very imposing, and one way is to make it the tallest element on the canvas. So I had to shift the background mountains down. And right now I'm just trying to clean up some of the silhouette on the mountains. And over here I'm trying to separate out each individual mountain. To do so, I simply use a lighter tone to separate them. So the one at the back will be lighter than the one in the foreground. Okay, so yeah, introducing some elements of that over here. Trying to play around with the silhouette, trying to get that shape right, and it's very sort of experimental still at this stage. You see that I am drawing and redrawing, and that actually takes up the bulk of the time when creating this environment concept sketches. You're just trying to figure out what's the most interesting shape that you can add to this piece. Right now I'm just adding in a little bit of texture to the sky. And then over here I am moving back to the castle to add a little bit more buildings. expanding on the castle, make it more grand. So again, the scale of the window is a great indication of how large the building structure really is. So the smaller the windows, the bigger the building will look. Therefore, over here I am reducing the scale of the windows. I'm cheating a little bit over here. I'm just duplicating that shape. Since I already did it, I might as well reuse it, right? Yep, so over here I am repainting the windows, but this time at a smaller size. Painting some of the nearby buildings back in. For this particular thumbnail, I did spend a little bit more time. I think I spent a total of 40 minutes just to add in a little bit more details. Trying to suggest out the cliff edge over here. And I'm adding in a roof for the new student that is sailing towards the school. I'm zooming in here, trying to work out the silhouette of the student. For each of my concept art, I like to introduce a little bit of a story element to it. Try to make the concept piece a little bit more interesting. I'm trying to clean up the shape of that character and adding a little bit of highlights to separate the character from the background layer. Again, it's just a silhouette. There's no details or anything like that. And over here, I am just re-adding the ripples. Man, turns out I don't really like the shape of the mountain ranges at the back. The problem is that it's very orderly. It's following a cascading order of the frontmost mountain being the tallest, the middle one being the medium, and then the one in the background being the shortest. And I really want to break up the monotony of that So I introduce another mountain range here. I'm trying to separate the sky with the background elements by making the sky a little bit brighter. So for this particular mountain range in the midground, I wanted to create a arch. Again, just trying my best to do something interesting. And on the arch, I'm gonna add in a little bit of a hint of civilization with another town. Again, I am spending a little bit more time on this particular concept as compared to the other two. And I definitely had the luxury of already having certain elements painted, because I simply copied from the previous concept. So here I'm just blocking in, suggesting that there are some buildings on top of that arch, and of course painting some lights to indicate that these buildings are occupied. So I'm quite happy with what I have here. Of course, I'm adding a little bit of fog to separate the midground from the foreground. Just fogging it up. Just fixing the sky over here, and editing the dragons a little bit. Of course, the final step would be to add in a curves adjustment layer to increase the contrast on the sketch, and then add in a black layer, set it to color dodge, and using a light tone I am painting in a lighting coming up from the moon. And from other parts. A bit of glow on the stars. And finally, I'm creating a layer set to overlay. I'm trying to add in a little bit of a vignette effect around the frame, so that the viewer's attention is captured within the canvas. And with that, I am done with this exercise. I have 3 thumbnails for my art director to select from. And that's it for today's tutorial. Hope that you guys learned something out of it, and I will see you next time.